My late wife came down to Salem one evening to have dinner with me. Uh, she worked for me part time, but most of the time she was up in Portland running her daycare center while I was down in Salem being a legislator. And this would have been 81, the first session I was chairman of the Judiciary Committee. And we were sitting there just enjoying a dinner by what they call the mill race. The water was running down. And along comes Dick Van Dyke's son, Chris Van Dyke, who was then the elected prosecuting attorney for Marion County and a rising star uh, with some of the charisma that his dad had and still has. But I said, well, congratulations uh, on your recent conviction of the I-5 killer. There was a serial killer that was hanging out around I-5 for his victims, and they eventually caught him and prosecuted him, and he'd gotten him convicted. And it was all over the press. And so he said, oh, thanks for the compliment. But he says, you no sooner accomplish one thing than something else comes along that's as bad or worse. And I said, whoa, what? So we were trying to have dinner. I wasn't trying to get into some big conversation, but he says, oh, well, there's this man who has stabbed two women and killed one of them, and now the governor is commuting his sentence. What? So he says, yeah, Dwayne Samples. It was in the news when he did it and when he got convicted, and he's now serving a life sentence, but the governor has commuted his sentence and he'll be out in a few months. What? So I started digging into it a little bit when I went back over to the Capitol, and I don't remember all the details of how I learned what I learned, but I think part of it, somebody dug it out in the newspaper, but there was a not a public relations, an advertising agency in Portland, well known, that Vick Atiyeh appealed to, that he didn't have enough money in his budget to do the entertaining at the governor's mansion that he wanted to do. And so they said, okay, we'll raise some money for you, Governor. And so they started raising money for him. Well, the person who was chairing that effort had read something about Dwayne Samples in the Rolling Stone, and she was so kinky, she wanted to meet somebody who'd stabbed two women. And so she went down to visit him at the penitentiary, and before you know it, they decided to get married. And the Rolling Stones made a big splash about it. Portland woman marries convicted stabbing killer. And but she marrying this guy decided to lobby the governor, who she was raising money for so he could entertain, to commute the sentence out of a sense of humanitarian. And the guy had applied once or twice already for parole and been turned down, but then he hired a psychologist who told him, you need to get a file full of records about your Vietnam post-traumatic stress syndrome that led you to be violent. Well, somewhere in the process, I got a hold of his diary he kept in a that thick ledger book, and I read day after day his diary, and it was just all about psychotic fantasies about getting a woman who was, I forget the word for it right now, but an Amazon woman, that's the word, and talking her into cutting his penis off. That's what he was fantasizing about. Well, but she talked Vic into commuting his sentence, but partly because he got the advice from a psychologist and then started filling his file, making it thick, with reports about his post-traumatic stress syndrome from his service in Vietnam, where he'd witnessed atrocities. So I then went and introduced two bills, one of them to allow the legislature to overturn a commutation, not a pardon, left the pardon law alone, but to overturn a commutation. And the other one was to refer that out to the public, to the voters, to determine whether they wanted to amend the Constitution in that fashion. Well, this caused a big furor and hoorah, and I will confess, I was playing politics partly because my friend Ted Kulongoski was getting ready to run for governor the first time, and I wanted Vic to have to explain to people as he traveled around the state campaigning for re-election how it was that he decided to commute the sentence of a guy who'd stabbed two women, one of them killing one of them. Well, to my great despair, I got it passed in the Senate with 19 votes, or 20. Kulongoski slipped around in the House and talked the House members into defeating the bill when it got over there. The ACLU had convinced him that we shouldn't be monkeying with the Constitution. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. I don't know, but that's what happened. And I tried my best. I got pretty wound up about all this, and later Vic rescinded his commutation. The only time in the history of the state a governor had ever done that. But then a few months later, after the furor died down and the legislature went home, but the parole board let Dwayne Samples out. He only served another year or two after I interfered with his commutation. And in his behalf, he went to California and never was heard of again, so far at least. So, politics.